Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we have a presentation of the proposed FY 2021 budget by our city manager. Before she begins tonight, I just wanted to say a few words. We know the uncertainty and the enormity of the COVID-19 crisis hangs over all of us. At this point, we don't know how long it will go on, and we are uncertain about the lasting impact it will have. And we know that as we enter into these next couple of weeks, it is likely they will be particularly difficult for all of us. Right now, we're reacting to the situation before us. And I know it is hard to think about a time when this crisis will pass, but there will be a time that it'll end. And then, although there are many certainties that face us right now that make planning harder for the future, we need to plan for the future, and we need to continue to do that. And we do that through looking at our budget this year. And we are just beginning the budget process. Tonight is the first night. As I said, the city manager will present her proposed budget. Normally, we do this and we have open houses where people can come, ask questions. Unfortunately, we're precluded from doing that because of the public health crisis. So tonight, we want to do a virtual question and answer. So after the city manager presents her budget, there'll be time for the city council to ask some clarifying questions and items for future discussions. This evening, we're not going to get into a lot of the details, but it's kind of big picture and what we'd like to see as we move forward in future work sessions. We will then take questions from the public. People have written in their questions and the city clerk has them, or they're with us today on our virtual meeting and can type in questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of their screen. Again, this is a time for questions this evening. We will have opportunities for public comments beginning on April 15th, as well as April 29th. There'll be time for public comments then, as well as I'm sure as in the past, individual members of the city council will be talking to and holding their own virtual meetings, collecting information and comments on the budget. I just want to take a moment and express my gratitude to the staff for preparing the proposed budget. It is an excellent document. It's very clear. It lays out a path forward. I know there will be changes as we work on it together, since much of this was prepared prior to the health crisis we're in right now. But the work the city staff has done is really just amazing, given this unprecedented situation we're in right now. And I just want to extend my thanks to all of them. And finally, just saying that coming together to support each other with kindness and compassion is how we're really going to get through this time together and look forward to a much brighter future. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our city manager for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be here with an actual budget, given the changes that we've been going through. Every year, preparing the city budget is a challenge. We don't have a budget office. We don't have dedicated budget staff. So it's an additional work assignment for our professional staff. This year was a little bit more difficult even for me because I didn't have a deputy city manager since our former deputy city manager had left for a new position in Colorado. I'm pleased today to have the first day with Jessica Clark, our new deputy city manager, and there she is. Looking forward to working with her and using her skills from Baltimore and other places, particularly in budgeting. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Susie.
The other thing, I guess I want to talk a little bit about the process. So just over a month ago, I began to be briefed on the coronavirus. And that was through my role as chair of the Chief Administrative Officers Committee of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government. It was sobering. And since then, we had the health emergency declared on March 13th. Staff have been working extremely hard to move to working remotely, to finding ways to help residents, finding ways to help businesses, and all the time trying to share communication about this very fluid situation. In a normal year, we would have had a budget document draft a little bit earlier, not public, but to be discussed with the senior staff and with council members. I've not had that opportunity this time because of the fast-moving pandemic response that was required. But we did what we could. We did put together a very good budget document, and there are a number of places, as you'll see this evening, where I note that there may be changes. One of the things that I really appreciate is that we have had a strong fiscal footing of the city for a long time. We have very thin revenues and very thin numbers of staff compared to the services that we do. But we are a fiscally sound community because of the hard work of our finance department and other senior staff and the council who've taken this very seriously. And I appreciate that. And I think you'll see that as we go through this process. Before I get into the document, I do want to take just a moment to let people know that I have new information from Adventist Healthcare about the Washington Adventist Hospital site. Many people have been asking about that. Starting about April 13th, non-COVID-19 patients will begin to be moved from the White Oak Hospital into Washington Adventist Hospital, and we'll be getting out information on that. Please note, the Washington Adventist Hospital will not be a place where you can walk in for services other than for the urgent care. There's no testing there. There's no emergency department. We'll get out that information, but it's taken a while to have some definite information about what will happen at the site, and I wanted to share that tonight. So now I'm going to go into my budget presentation, and let's see if I can load this up well. Okay, I think I'm on. I nicknamed this budgeting in uncertain times, and we certainly have that. So here's the big picture. The proposed budget was mostly prepared before the COVID-19 emergency was declared, but even then it was a maintenance of effort budget with no new major initiatives or services proposed. When the pandemic hit Maryland, the proposed budget numbers and projects were reevaluated and some modifications were made. And other modifications you'll see as we go through this process will be identified, and the council will be considering them as they go through the budget consideration process. As I said, we've had years of careful fiscal stewardship, and so the city of Takoma Park is on solid financial ground right now. It also has the flexibility to consider options as more is learned about the impacts of the pandemic now and through the coming years. So we'll go through a budget schedule, a budget overview, council priorities, and next steps. The budget schedule's in our newsletter. It's on the website. Tonight is my presentation. There'll be budget work sessions on a series of Mondays, April 13th, 20th, and 27th. And then we have a public hearing on the 15th and a public hearing on April 29th. Another budget work session, which is reconciliation, would be May 4th. And then there's the voting on the budget ordinances. There's many opportunities for the public to weigh in and ask questions through this process, and for the council to have strong discussions. Like to just cheer our finance director, Susan Chung, for the second year in a row that she has won the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award for our last budget. She has been doing a great job and winning multiple awards from the Government Finance Officers Association for her careful work with our financial systems and the things that are entrusted to us financially. So here's some numbers, a sheet of numbers, ones that the council may come back to it at a variety of times. List the total revenue of all funds, about 30 million. Total general fund revenue, which is primarily tax revenue, and and other revenue that is not dedicated for specific purposes, about 27 million. Proposed total real property tax revenue at 13,932,654. Total expenditures of all funds, 36.5 million. Total general fund expenditures, 33.4 million. And as you may have seen in the newsletter, I'm proposing a tax rate increase from our current rate, which is 53.97 cents per $100 assessed valuation for tax purposes, to 55.5 cents. As we go through this, each cent of the real property tax equals about $251,000. And the difference between the current tax rate and the proposed tax rate is $384,000. What that means for folks is if the current tax rate was desired to be kept, then cuts of about $384,000 would be needed to get down to the 53.97 current tax rate. The constant yield tax rate is 52.91. That would be the amount where we would get the same amount of tax revenue next year as is expected to be received this year. The constant yield tax rate plus the employment cost index for state and local government employees, which includes health benefits, would be a 2.9% increase to a tax rate of 54.44. And the difference between the current tax rate and the 54.44 is 118,000. So as the council looks at this and goes through the reconciliation process, cuts of $118,000 would get to the 54.44 tax rate, which is the constant yield tax rate plus the ECI. This is a factor that has been considered in the past couple council budget deliberations, and so that's why I've included it for their consideration. Every year we function with three main budget principles. One is to pay ongoing costs with ongoing funds. The second is to maintain infrastructure even when the budget is tight. And the third is to follow legal mandates and strive to meet best practices. And this budget does all three. As I go through, I'll mention a little bit about the general fund revenues, which are the various property taxes, the income tax, intergovernmental revenue, and charges for services. We have three other funds: the stormwater fund, special revenue funds, which are funds that are specific for a particular purpose, such as community development block grant funds or cable funds for particular needs. And then we have the speed camera fund that comes from speed camera fines. So I'm going to go through a number of charts and a number of pages of points. And these are things that will be gone through in more detail in the budget work sessions. In the general fund revenue, 92% of the general fund revenue comes from just three sources. One are property taxes. Those are the real property, the personal property, and railroad and utility taxes. That makes up 53.7% of the general fund revenue. We're in the second year of the triennial assessment, and we are, for that reason, we're not likely to be affected by the pandemic for property tax purposes in the coming 2 years. There will be some effects, and we'll go through that in detail when we get into this topic. But in general, we are locked into what was a very low triennial assessment that began last year. We get about a quarter of our general fund revenue from interjurisdictional funds. This is tax duplication money, and this is state payments, such as police aid and highway user revenue. In our last recession, which unfortunately I was deputy city manager for, I got a lot of experience in what it meant when those payments were cut. It took several years before the county and the state were affected by the reduced revenue from the Great Recession. And then when the county and the state did cut the payments, that's when we had to take other actions. That was about 4 years after the recession started. About 13% of our revenue comes from income tax. That is, again, based on 2019 income. So there will be a delay before the income tax impacts are felt on Tacoma Park. In Tacoma Park and the other municipalities, by state law, 17% of what would otherwise go to the county comes to the municipality. And we do not have, we're traditionally not affected heavily by changes in capital gains earnings, which can more directly affect Montgomery County. 8% of our general fund revenue comes for charges for services. It is a small amount in the greater scheme of things, but this is the one area where I imagine that there will be some immediate impacts from the pandemic. $640,000 of our charges for services is recreation department related revenue. And then we also have parking revenue. Right now, we do have a reduction in revenue from our rec programs that are not being offered, our after school programs and that kind of spring break camp. But we will need to see how long the pandemic lasts to know what the impact will be on FY21. One of the most important numbers for me is the unassigned general fund balance. And this year it's 1.8 million. Traditionally, we've tried to have over 3 million, and the council policy is to require that this amount should be at least 17% of the general fund operating revenues, which would be about 4.6 million. However, as in the past 2 years, there is money set aside to ensure that the city has funds to pay for the library project. And as expenditures are made on the library project, those funds are freed up to become part of the unassigned fund balance. If we move forward on the library project, that frees up approximately $3.6 million for FY21, which would allow for an unassigned fund balance at the end of FY21 of $5.4 million. This year, for FTEs, full-time equivalent employees, we have a 1.98 increase in full-time equivalents. It's primarily the proposal to add one new information technology position. This is a critical position, and you'll see I address that coming up. The rest of the hours are adjustments primarily in part-time hours. About a third of those are related to a proposed before care program at the Tacoma Park Recreation Center, which was one of the few new proposals in this budget. There are other kind of moves between part-time hours among departments. We'll get into that during work sessions. However, I do feel that this is an area where the FTEs related to part-time hours is likely to be reduced because of the pandemic. Excuse me. Personnel costs are one of the largest portions of the city budget because we provide services. And so personnel costs are an element that normally increases some. And so I'd like to go through those right now. Currently, the city is in contract negotiations with its 2 unions that represent non-management employees. We have 3-year collective bargaining agreements, and they're all due to expire on June 30. But due to the pandemic, we have agreements with both unions to put those wage negotiations temporarily on hold till at least the end of August. And the normal July 1 pay increases for staff are also on hold. This will give us an opportunity to see what the what is happening with the pandemic, and also have an opportunity to have somewhat normal negotiations because it's very difficult to do remotely. In the personnel costs, there are some additional intern hours proposed. These do not affect the FTE numbers, but they do count in the personnel costs. And as we go through again, we may find some of these intern hours will be less because of the pandemic. The cost of employee health insurance benefits were estimated before the pandemic hit. Our providers are now indicating the cost may increase more than projected because of the pandemic. It doesn't look like a lot, but we're in negotiations with those healthcare providers right now, and it is something that we'll need to consider as we look through the numbers. And as I mentioned, due to the pandemic, there may be some positions that will not be filled beginning July 1, and so there may be some financial savings simply due to that. Regarding capital projects and purchases, this is an area also that has kind of big ticket items. It should be noted that there are very few new capital projects or purchases in the FY21 CIP, Capital Improvement Program. When you look through the document and you look at those capital improvement projects, it's important to look at the source of funding. The ones that are indicated as being funded through the general fund are directly from taxpayer money. Others are from special revenue accounts or monies that have been set aside in the past that are restricted to those purposes. And so they're cutting those projects or delaying those projects generally does not have an impact on the current budget. Nevertheless, I did, as going through this, propose to delay some of the projects. I proposed to delay the atrium fill-in and police communications area renovation work. This is money, these were monies in the facility maintenance reserve, but there's not enough money in the facility maintenance reserve for that project, so it would require some general fund monies. I've moved that to FY22. And I also moved quite a lot of sidewalk work into FY22. Those are paid for by general fund monies. Both of those projects could move up if funds were available, but I also felt that a delay in them does not cause kind of long-term impacts to the city. Other items in the capital budget are IT security improvements, which are essential. There's a number of bus shelter site improvements, both for new bus shelters and for ADA improvements around bus stops. And then there's $500,000 for road maintenance proposed for FY21. I strongly believe that we need to do the IT security improvements and the road maintenance because delays in those would either put the city at risk or it would cause much greater costs to the city in the future. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the library, and it seems like an obvious thing to say, gee, maybe we shouldn't do the library when a lot is in flux. The library project is recommended to proceed, and it's in the financial interest of the city to proceed with the library design to construction documents. Funds are available for the project. They are not easily transferable to any other project or other use. The $7 million library bond is primarily for the library project. It could be used for other improvements to the community center, provided they are of a similar size, cost, and lifespan. The atrium fill-in and even a full renovation of the full police department would not meet that level. It was only about $3.3 million. And that full renovation was on an out year of the CIP, not to begin until FY24 later. The atrium fill-in was proposed for FY22, which would help the area where our dispatch functions, but the full renovation of the police department, which is needed, is not scheduled for several years. Nevertheless, it's not appropriate probably to use the money from the library bond for that because it doesn't meet the same size and cost of the library project. The $300,000 we have in state grants are for the library project only. And I've proposed using $2.5 million in capital cable grant funds for the library. These funds are restricted to capital expenditures that facilitate city TV operations, infrastructure of wiring, and public safety communications technology. Because a number of the aspects of the library project meet those criteria, these funds are appropriate to be used for sections of the library project. The full cable fund reserve totals about $3.5 million, so there's sufficient funds remaining for other city TV and future uses. In a recession, construction costs often decline. And one of the biggest issues that was even in the most recent projection of the construction costs for the library was labor costs, which are likely to decline in the coming months. Having the library project designed and the construction documents completed will allow us to take advantage of possible lower construction pricing. As part of that project, the architect is also to be identifying what the various costs of the components of the library are, so that as the council is reviewing the library plans, they could reduce or change the library project to save funds that way as well. If money is not spent on the library, the restricted bond reserve will remain in place, and those funds will not be released to the unassigned fund balance. And particularly given the fact that we're have economic uncertainty, I would prefer to have those funds in the unassigned reserve if that would be possible. We will be having more discussion of the library on next Wednesday, on April 15th, for the remaining funds for the design contract. When you look through, departmental budgets represent few changes from the current year. As I mentioned before, a new IT specialist position is proposed. It increases the staff from 3 employees and a part-time intern to 4 full-time employees. Given the heavy demands on the staff related to protecting the city from ransomware attacks, the IT department oversees the important phones and CAD systems for our police department. They oversee the security of our financial systems, and they're helping us work remotely and do this virtual council meeting. Right now they're working way too many hours. We do need that 4th position. Many of our city activities are moving to technological solutions, which also does reduce the need for additional new staff while providing better service to residents. A couple other departmental items. As I mentioned, the rec department proposed to begin providing before-school care for students at the Tacoma Park Rec Center. There was strong interest, there still is a strong interest by Ward 6 residents to have that service. The service would result in a net gain in income for the city because they pay fees for that service, but it does increase the part-time FTE hours. Again, these plans may be delayed as a result of the pandemic. As I mentioned before, several departments had intern positions added in this budget. They were going to have them for this current year, but they cut them at the last minute last year. They trying to reinstate them. Nevertheless, those interns or training opportunities may be affected by the pandemic and will be considered by the council as we go through the budget deliberation. And I'll also note that additional funds were put into the city council budget line for increased compensation for the incoming council, as well as putting the conference expenses for the council restored to the FY19 level. The city council has not yet heard their presentation from the council compensation committee, and the conferences may be affected by the pandemic. And so that's something that the council will be considering as it goes through the details. The non-departmental budget remains similar to FY20. We're projecting a work compensation amount to increase some. The actual costs will not be known before the budget is adopted, so we're still in communication with the entities to try to get good numbers for that workers' compensation cost. And in the non-departmental budget, there's funds allocated for festival support. Again, the pandemic may affect festivals and what that means for our support. Nevertheless, one thing that's really important in our budget are the number of programs that are to help people who need help in Tacoma Park. And I think it sets us apart as a very small community with a small budget, with a small revenue stream, how much assistance we give to people, primarily low to moderate income residents in Tacoma Park. I'd like to go through briefly some of the kinds of programs that we have and note that a number of these are income qualified. One that's not income qualified, but has a large element to our large cost to our city revenue stream is rent stabilization. We receive less money from multifamily property owners because we have rent stabilization. Nevertheless, it's an important component of keeping the Tacoma Park a livable city for all residents, and it's particularly important as we have the Purple Line built. We have the homeowner property tax supplement. We have supplemented the state and the county's programs for folks who are low to moderate income and need help paying their property taxes. And we helped about 140 people last year. The number may go up a little bit this year, but we've been committed to this for many, many years, and it's an important program. Our Emergency Assistance Fund has been getting a workout with the pandemic, and so we've been putting some extra funds into that. I appreciate a number of people have donated money, and I don't have the total so far for those donations. I appreciate it very much. Our staff is working night and day to help people who are all of a sudden without funds, that live paycheck to paycheck, are concerned about rent. They haven't seen the money from the federal government yet. And so we're there to help. We also have been, we have our grants to community organizations, which also help many of the same people. This year, we've really started workforce services. We have connected many people to workforce training and jobs, and this is going to be critical as we come out of the pandemic. Another area that we have been putting an enormous amount of time and energy on is assistance to businesses and the business associations. We've got operating contracts, facade programs, mini grants, and we are lots of hand-holding. Again, staff is very tired because we're trying to help businesses who are immediately impacted by the pandemic. We will be meeting them, connecting them to the bigger sources of funds at the federal, state, and county levels. And we're going to be there by their side as we come out of the pandemic. We have funds to help people with lower incomes pay for tree removal. We have funds to help them make energy and other sustainability improvements. And we have a homestretch down payment assistance program, which has helped several people. And it's a way that we let people be able to buy the houses in our community. So this proposed budget is crafted to advance the council's priorities. They were adopted in March of 2019. They were reaffirmed this past spring. And they are a livable community for all, a fiscally sustainable government, which I'm very committed to, environmentally sustainable community, engaged, responsive, and service-oriented government, and community development for an improved and equitable quality of life. I have to say that what has happened in this current fiscal year is absolutely remarkable for a small town on many of these elements. And I'm very proud to work for a community that is doing all that it's doing. Under a livable community for all, we're looking at responding to the pandemic and planning for pandemic recovery, completing the design for the library and moving it to construction, continuing to implement the Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan. We've identified an additional $110,000 contribution to the Affordable Housing Fund, continuing to advocate for reuse of the Washington Adventist Hospital site to benefit the city and the community. We're doing an enormous amount on community policing efforts, and we have wonderful new officers that have been helping people right now and are on the streets right now helping people despite the pandemic. We've done a lot of racial equity training where I'm very proud to work with a council that will be using race equity as a way to make some decisions with this budget. In this budget, we have some street, we have some sidewalk, we have bus stop, bikeway improvements, all to advance our sustainability and Vision Zero goals. We have funds for community grants and partnerships, and we have community events and arts programming. On fiscally sustainable government, we're going to be doing careful monitoring of and planning for the impacts from the pandemic this year and in the future year and years to come. The proposed budget also has some fund balance. we have some other sources of funds in emergency funds that we may be using in this pandemic year. We do also have a contribution of $50,000 in addition to the actuarially recommended amount for the police retirement plan. And that's something that is always discussed by the council in budget reconciliation discussions. Environmentally sustainable community. The council adopted a climate emergency response framework resolution this year. We have a community engagement process to go through related to that. Major efforts, not a lot of there's no extra funds for that, just the funds that we've already been identified for sustainability work. We'll be completing the Flower Avenue Green Street project. It's moving along and the sidewalk is getting built. And I'm trying to think about how many years I've waited for the sidewalk to be built. Stormwater improvements. Have to say some of the stormwater improvements in our community are awesome. And I was looking at Glenside Drive with the sidewalks and the stormwater improvements there. It has made a community now livable that used to be flooded. And we have to look as we deal with climate change, what can we do to deal with flooding in our community? And then we have rebates and grants for clean and efficient energy use. On engaged, responsive, and service-oriented government, again, we increase FTEs by 1.98. It's primarily due to the addition of the full-time IT position, which is extremely important. We've also been doing and will continue to do communication outreach and provide services to residents and businesses related to the pandemic and the pandemic recovery. And for community development for an improved and equitable quality of life, implementing the Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan. It seems like a long time ago that was adopted, but it really is a phenomenal plan. And the elements in that are being used today. They were being used as we helped businesses that were affected by Purple Line construction. We're using them to address the pandemic. You'll be using them to address the recovery from the pandemic. And we're doing lots of work with residents in apartment buildings and looking at ways that we can address the housing needs of the city. We have business assistance and workforce development occurring throughout the city. We need to capitalize on opportunity zone designation and do New Hampshire Avenue redevelopment. Despite the pandemic, we're moving forward on community engagement processes related to the Tacoma Park Rec Center and how do we do that in a pandemic. And Tacoma Junction development is continuing at some point, probably after the pandemic. Our next steps are to have work sessions. The next work session, I will focus on the services that related to livable community for all. The second work session would focus on the capital improvement program, and then a more general one for the third work session. Then there's reconciliation and approval of the budget ordinances. I think through this process, normally we would have had a lot of time some time to have worked out the kinks in some of these elements. But the pandemic hit us right at the time when we would be making those decisions. And so the council will have a lot more to discuss. I'm looking forward to that collaborative approach of coming up with a budget that protects the city and looks forward to the future. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Now I'll ask the City Council if they have any general questions. Again, this is our opportunity just to sort of ask some bigger picture questions and request information for the follow-up work sessions. So we're not going to get into the weeds tonight. If you look at your participant list down at the bottom and pull it up, you can click raise your hand and I can call on you. Councilwoman Kostick found it first, so she can go first.
Thank you. I was literally raising my hand, so Thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation tonight and also putting together the budget document during what I know is a really, really difficult time. So thank you very much for this. I have a lot of questions, and obviously we'll be getting more in depth into this in the coming weeks, as well as you know, each of us will have an opportunity to delve into the actual document more. I know I'm still going through kind of the nitty-gritty of it. But I wanted to ask some kind of bigger picture questions with regard to the impact of the current situation and the pandemic, and as you're looking towards next year, as well as, you know, maybe you had mentioned we might not be, we're probably not looking at being impacted by significant revenue changes this year, but we might be down the line. And so I'm wondering what sort of things you thought about as you put together this budget and you're thinking about in terms of preparing for the potential of that in the future.
Thank you. There are some things that can be dealt with right away for some relatively smaller items. I did live through the recession here as deputy city manager, and there were a couple of things that were important. We kept moving forward on some of our major infrastructure projects, but we laid off a lot of staff. And so when it got to that point, there was a real discussion with the council about what were services that were essential versus those that could be cut. And we made really hard choices and we let staff go. And unlike larger organizations that can do furloughs or can do kind of, we froze pay, but it doesn't add up very much. And so one of the things that we learned was that basically if it's something very significant, we can't just tweak it. And so part of what we're going to look at is to see what happens with the actual impact of the pandemic. What is the potentially positive response of the federal government for both the state and the county resources as well as ours? And we're keeping very close track of our expenses. But part of this is we'll have a series of options to consider, but we don't know what they are yet. And so one of the things that I think about is, you know, it's one thing to cut a couple positions. It's another thing to cut an entire service. It's another thing to cut 12 positions. We're not in the position yet to know the magnitude of that. And it really are very different conversations in the community depending on the magnitude. So if it's not a large magnitude, it's something that we can deal with. If it's something larger, then that's a whole different discussion. We're not at the point to know what those numbers are yet. When we know, then we'll be able to come through to the council with a number of options about the approach. I just have no idea at this point. I just know I lived with it before, so I saw what worked and what wasn't useful.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously there are a lot of uncertainties in terms of specifics and what the actual outcome will be. So I absolutely understand that. I also wanted to ask, with regard to the impact on the existing expenditures this year in FY20, what sort of impacts you see on the budget for next year in terms of funds that might not be spent this year and might need to be carried over, as well as unexpected expenditures in this year. And related to that, I was curious whether the estimates on page 30, which is the I believe that is the general fund revenue estimates. I was wondering whether those have been updated based on the estimates for FY20 and the estimates for FY21, if those have been updated based on the current situation and those are estimates with keeping that in mind, or if some of those were based on previous assumptions, particularly with regard to like the recreation funds, parking, speed camera, those sorts of funds.
We looked at the numbers. I think they're going to be pretty close because I think there's things that offset the loss of revenue with not having some expenses. They're not very large numbers, but part of partly we're going to have to see even just over the next couple of weeks what things look like for, say, summer camps. And so that's something that I'm hoping as we get into work session, we'll have a little bit more idea about.
Great, thank you. And I'll just ask one more quick question and turn it over to my colleagues. And I know there's members of the public that want to ask questions as well. I was just curious in terms of things that you anticipate seeing change in the budget. I know you've said that there might be some things that will shift a little more this year than in previous years, just because of the pandemic, as well as just the time frame that you've had to work with this while you're doing other things. Are there particular items you think are likely to shift, or that you have your eye on for potentially changing or needing to change?
I have a list of things that I think you'll want to consider to cut. And then there are some items that I think are some new staff information that would make some modifications. So yes, I've been keeping a list. You know, to me, it's not my call to make a change to some of the council generated items. And so that'll be a part of the discussion as we go through the work sessions.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thanks for putting together the presentation. A couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
One, have you looked at and can you present to the council what the budget would look like if there was a 1% reduction and a 3% reduction?
A reduction in what?
In expenses that you know, whether it's
I've not done that. To me, I think it's a little more useful to look at the specifics. There's, especially given the pandemic, this isn't just a thing where we just save money. It's we look at what things aren't likely to happen because of the pandemic, and we look at some of the other items. So I think we're just going to be looking in terms of real money, not in terms of percentages.
Okay. What about if we tapped into the housing fund and used some of that money for residents that are in need? Do you have any idea what would be a good number for us to consider?
I don't yet, but certainly I've heard a number of people suggest using that. You know, I would like to have it consistent with some of the provisions in the Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan for the kinds of uses, but that's very much the council call.
And then finally, regarding the IT FTE, rather than an FTE, have you considered a consultant type of contract, and whether or not that would be less expensive than bringing on a full-time employee?
I prefer not to do a consultant. We do have consultants and contracts for a number of our services because of the sensitivity of a number of our items and the costs that we've found that are associated with the consultants. I think we do better having a full-time person.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, Councilman DeBala. Did I just lose her? Councilman DeBala?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. There you are.
Thank you. Some of my questions are similar to Casey's, and I'll spare the detailed questions. I'll just send them in. When might you be able to identify a list of options for the council to consider if we felt that we needed to be more conservative than this budget shows?
I'm collecting them now. It would be as we go through the work sessions, I'll identify them so you can consider what you want to put on reconciliation lists.
Would it be, I might prefer it all at once rather than over the different sessions, but we can talk about that. I'm wondering also about the expenses this year, and again, going back to that table on page 30, if it's possible for you to go through and make some estimates about what we know now, based on what we know now, some estimates of where we might come short and where we might have expenses you said y'all are tracking expenses
Right.
in the hopes that we might get reimbursed, but maybe we could see what they are. And it may be that they're not huge, but I think it would be nice for everyone to have a sense of the magnitude of both of those right now in the fiscal year. So
I will share them as I get them.
And I'm wondering what personnel cost assumptions you made. You said that union negotiations are on hold. That makes perfect sense to me. And in the budget, you make some assumptions about staff salaries, and I'd like to get some information on that.
Sure, that's because we're in negotiations. That would be something that would be confidential information, and we'll share with council.
Okay, I guess I thought you just said you weren't in negotiations, but never mind.
Well, we've not finished negotiations. we're on hold for negotiations. So it's something that we would need to talk with the council about.
Okay, great. And what, sorry, one more thing, one more general question. Can we get, again, fairly small brush level, but can we get a list of the intern hours or the interns or some?
Yes.
Or point me in the book to where it is?
Yeah, I think I'll need to give you some, get them separately, because I don't think they show up well in the book.
Okay, that might be but why I couldn't find them. Yeah, I'd really, if at all possible, I'd like to see a little more detail on the revenues projections for this year and the out years, what Casey said, so we could see what the impacts are.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I would like to welcome Jessica Clark, our new Deputy City Manager.
Yay.
And good to see you aboard.
Thanks so much.
I also want to thank our City Manager, Suzanne Ludlow, and all the work of the staff that brought this budget to us. I know it was especially complicated this year with the pandemic coming full force right in the middle of the budget process. So thank you all very much for your extra work under difficult conditions. I just had one question, and that was if you have anticipated and included any exceptional costs within the public safety arena because of the pandemic.
I'm paying our police officers who have the likelihood of actually being in physical contact or in people's homes an extra hazard pay bonus during the pandemic. We certainly are getting some new equipment, some additional personal protective equipment, although we were pretty well prepared. I think unless things change, I think we won't have extraordinary expenses, but we are keeping track of it very carefully. We're looking at best practices by other police departments, we're on conference calls about every day about how the police department should be acting and what are the right things for them to use. So I think we're in pretty good shape, but we are keeping track of those expenses carefully.
And I'd just like to thank my colleagues on the council for their foresightedness in moving us to a more community-oriented police department in time for this. It couldn't be a more critical decision that was made that is affecting the relationships between the community, the serving of the community, and yet at the same time being a professional police department. Thank you. And that's all.
Great. Councilman Searcy.
For putting together, oh, I'm muted. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So thank you so much for putting together this budget. I feel like I say this every budget cycle. This is one of the trickiest budgets to deal with because you don't have many sources for incoming revenue. And then the programs, for the most part, are tiny. So at the end of the day, The only thing that you can really cut to put a substantial dent in the budget are people and large SIP projects.
That's right.
It makes things pretty tricky when it comes to trying to identify places where we may be able to kind of fill a gap. So a couple of points. I want to echo my colleagues in trying to identify which projects, again, I recognize it's going to be a small amount of money, but which projects have the potential to be carryovers. And that's not just for the items that are on page 30, but also any SIP projects, anything that basically, because of COVID, let's assume that it's going to last until the end of the budget cycle. So until like July 1. And if that's the case, what projects, if we were not able to, that we haven't already started, haven't already awarded, would we likely be able to move into the next, the next fiscal year and see what that would look like? I don't know to what extent we have vacancies in terms of staff positions, or what our normal attrition rate is for staff. But we might want to think about the possibility of playing around with the attrition rate, understanding that we need an IT specialist, which I agree wholeheartedly. Like, one thing this thing has taught you is that you pay your IT staff and you pay them well because they keep you functioning during times like this. But trying to figure out where, there might be a little bit of wiggle room because we naturally have, I'm making it up, a 10% attrition rate, or we currently have X number of positions that are vacant that may not be priority for filling, or we may not fill them until probably later in the fiscal year, and kind of accounting for those salaries. Again, it's kicking the can because ultimately once you start hiring folks, that budget is gonna kick in, but it might also kind of help us to get through what is a really funky fiscal year of not knowing what's the impacts of COVID, and then trying to anticipate what we would need during a normal circumstance. Another thing that I wanted to make sure that we were able to do, and that's talk about some of the areas where we know we need continued funding. I mean, how many times do we have to have something like furloughs and now COVID to recognize there's a huge swath of our community that is really one paycheck away from losing their homes, not being able to buy groceries, not being able to care for their children. And so we need to be mindful of that and try to make provisions, because as we know, it's likely to get worse before we see any reprieve. So things like trying to figure out novel ways to use our housing reserves, trying to figure out ways to use our emergency assistance dollars, coming up with trying to deal with financial literacy. Some people may think that that's kind of weird. Oh, you want to put money towards financial literacy and employment training, but that's how you kind of stop the cycle, right? You teach a man how to fish kind of thing. And we may be in a place where we need to start thinking about those types of initiatives in order to make sure that the next thing that happens, we're not automatically having to crank out lots of money because we haven't really prepared our businesses and our low to moderate income residents about how to manage, resources in a way to kind of ride these types of waves in the future. So again, I appreciate all of the hard work, and I look forward to additional discussions about ways in which we might be able to kind of get over this hurdle. I'm the first to say, if possible, I want us to stay flat. I also would encourage staff to think about other places where we may inadvertently charge people money for things, and the impacts of those as well. So I know that we're not going to be able to really get into stormwater management, but stormwater management fees, how all of that stuff is going to shake out, other kinds of fee-based systems and what those costs entail, because there's going to be a tail tied to not just the end of our fiscal year, which will be in July, but the experience that residents will feel as a result of perhaps being unemployed for 3 to 4 months. And so kind of thinking through novel approaches to kind of put certain things on pause or foregoing certain fees in order to allow our residents to catch up in accordance to the law. So again, look forward to continued discussions.
Yep, look forward to it.
Great, Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you, and thank you to the city manager for doing all the work to assemble this. Appreciate it. Two brief things and then two slightly longer questions. We don't need it now, but if you could let us know going forward a little bit more about the status of the police pension. I've generally been somebody who has opposed putting in extra money beyond what the actuaries recommend each year. In this case, I know you've asked for an extra 50,000, but it would be worth understanding more about where those funds are invested so that we can assess the extent to which they're, at risk with everything that's happening with the stock market. So just for when we get into the work sessions, that would be one useful thing. And I do agree with Councilmember Smith that I'd like to look at having the housing fund be potentially used. I think more for renters who are having trouble, because it does seem to me as if in the short term anyway, for homeowners, because of some of the national mortgage forbearance programs that have been announced, and certainly here in Maryland, it seems as if no foreclosures would really be going forward. It may be that renters are facing a bigger challenge than homeowners. So, and I know we'll be talking about, but to me, that would be a good use of those funds for us to look at. Two slightly more complicated questions, and you can see how you want to answer them. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is this is happening timing-wise right while we're having to put the budget together without us really knowing what the progress or the projections are for how the virus will roll out. And there's a lot of reasons, of course, why that's really bad. But I'm just wondering whether it would be possible for us, with the fiscal year starting on July 1st, to adopt a budget. We always, in our budget, can make changes over the course of the year, and we adopt various budget amendments and things of that nature and shift funds from this fiscal year to the next one and so on. But to build in more sort of flexibility into the budget so that over the course of the coming fiscal year, we can have, I don't know whether it should be quarterly or more often or less often or whatever, but checking in to see sort of where we stand so that, for example, if we've postponed or delayed a given capital project, and then we sort of see maybe things go better than expected in terms of, a vaccine being discovered or whatever, or things go worse, then we'd understand whether we're going to maybe move that project up or push it further back. So I know in theory, we always have the ability to do that, but it'd be good if it was possible to somehow build that more into the budget. Is that something that is doable?
It's absolutely doable. It used to be done that there was like a January look at the budget and with kind of a number of items on a queue that you might be able to move forward on that were otherwise kind of just put on pause. That's certainly, I would recommend that. I think it's a good idea. Okay. We do have quarterly financial reports. That's also a good time to kind of see if there's an issue one place or the other. In this, because of the pandemic, I think that we really do need to have, some look about quarterly about what we want to do.
And it sort of strikes me that if we postpone, well, I don't know, should there be an extra reserve that we create? Because based on what you were saying, at least looking at how the effect came in with the financial crisis, if it is delayed a couple of years because we don't get our money from hotels and sales taxes, but from other things like the property tax and a little bit from income tax, if it's delayed a couple of years, I guess the question I have is, should we think about setting aside some additional funds that maybe we don't know exactly how to use, but that would be available if in 2 or 3 or 4 years that happens again, and whether that's just the unassigned balance or some special separate coronavirus fund. Is that, I mean, do we have
So-
the ability to do that? Could we operate in that way?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, you certainly can set up some funds. I think, I mean, that's why I feel very strongly about having good reserves, because we have times like this. I think it's also going to be important that it's going to take a couple months, but as we get into the pandemic and the recovery, you know, there'll be several options that you'll be kind of saying, well, if it kind of goes this way, then here's some steps we take. If it goes this way, here's some options that we can look at. And I think, you know, it's incumbent on us to have that, be very upfront about it, and then have those check-in points where you can decide. The one thing that you can't do in midstream is set a different tax rate. So the biggest issue for you here is to set a tax rate that gives you what you feel is appropriate for FY21. And so, for example, when you're looking at the numbers, you know, you might be able to cut the 300-some thousand that gets you from the 55.5-cent rate down to the current, but you may not want to do that. You may want to put some of that aside in a special reserve. And so that's part of what you might discuss. You may cut some things, but you may not necessarily lower the tax rate and recognize that it sets aside for a reserve. I think there's some other places to look for that as well. So as we go through the details, that would be part of what we would want to specify.
But whatever the tax rate is, if, say, for example, we decided, okay, we're going to postpone Project X, which is a capital project, once we're into the fiscal year, we can't change the tax rate, as you said. So those funds, we could think of them as potentially being available for something different that year that might be more directly responsive to problems that are caused by the coronavirus, right?
That's right.
Okay. And then the last question is, you don't have to answer it all now. I just think every year we sort of grapple with trying to get a better understanding of this. And that's the way in which the unassigned balance and the connection to the bond reserve, and how when we look at some of the tables, it seems to show that the expenditures exceed the revenues, but we're not operating at a deficit. And I think some of that is how the charts are presented, which don't always show there that we have these other reserves. So I'm not asking you to go through all that. And I know there are residents who want to participate here too, but I think that would be, again, you've done it in past years, but if we can get a clear understanding of that in one of the upcoming work sessions, I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah. That actually was a goal for this year that we did not manage to get it into this document, but we certainly will share it.
If we talk about it, that'll be great. Thank you.
We'll share it as we go through.
Great. Is that it? All right. Thank you. I guess I'm last. Everyone has asked terrific questions, and I'm looking forward to the work sessions moving forward. I would like to say that I think, as the city manager pointed out, our staff's ability to react so rapidly to the current crisis, setting up the mini grants program, helping residents in the community, is a direct result from having some of these things we've talked about in place already, our Housing Reserve Fund, the Emergency Assistance Program. And I guess the thing I will be looking at as we move forward is how do we want to augment them? I know there is in the proposed budget an increase in the Housing Reserve Fund, but is that sufficient? Do we want to look at putting more in there as we go forward over the next couple of years, thinking about the assistance residents may need? I don't think honestly, I wrote down all my questions, and I think my colleagues have raised them already. So I don't want to take up too much time. And I do want to say, though, thank you so much for this presentation. I think from the very beginning of the presentation, where we've been moving towards to understand what our tax rate would look at, what revenue we would get with different tax rates and how that would play out, is the clearest that we've been presented. And so thank you for building on all that year's work. And I'll just say that I am a proponent of trying to look at how we can do the constant yield plus the ECI, because that says that we are increasing the tax rate by an indication of inflation. And I think given that things generally cost more as we go on, that is a good way to look at our tax rate. So this year we may want to do a little bit more because of the circumstances, but thank you for presenting that in such a clear manner this year moving forward. So I'm going to turn it over now, I think, to our city clerk if she has questions. We took questions in two ways. People could write in emails and the city manager has questions. And I know we have one question already queued up from people who have joined us on the Zoom webinar tonight. Again, we're just taking questions this evening, comments to this, for the questions for the city manager. We will be taking public comments during our meetings coming up in April. Just a reminder, when we do our work sessions on Monday night, they're just work sessions and we usually don't take public comments during them. So public comments will be available on the Wednesday evening meetings, and we'll make all the sign-up information available on the website. Now, Ms. Carpenter, are you ready to go?
I am ready.
Great.
So I have to say there's a good bit of duplication in the questions that have been asked, and I'm going to try not to duplicate. And I have to say residents are thinking about a lot of the same questions that the council members asked. So so there's a lot of duplication here. Could the city manager say a little bit more about the police pension plan, given what have to be recent investment losses? Is the proposed budget contribution sufficient considering the current state of the plan, including those potential investment losses?
That's a good question. We're actually to be meeting with the investment advisors for the pension plan coming up in a few weeks. They've certainly been keeping us apprised, and like anybody who's watching investments, they bounce around and they have gone down some. The question about what does it make sense to put in the $50,000 above the actuarially recommended amount is a good question that I would like to ask them. And also, I think, you know, one of the most difficult things about investments are that you can't just say from one day what that means. And so seeing if we get a little bit of stopping the bouncing, I think that will be helpful. But I will be reporting back to the council what we hear from the investment advisors.
Okay, thank you. But another question, what is the contingency plan in the event that taxes and utility fees or intergovernmental funds for FY21 are substantially lower than expected or than for previous years?
So there's, first of all, I don't expect that they will be substantially lower in FY21, given the kinds of funds that we have, including and the follow-up discussions that have been held with our county and state officials. I don't anticipate that will happen for FY21. It's the nature of when those funds are populated that make the difference. Nevertheless, if we would find that there was a substantial decrease in FY21, I would have a plan or several recommendations coming to council. As I've noted, the negotiations with our two unions are on pause right now, but we would have discussions with them. We have gone through this before, so we kind of know the way that looks. I would anticipate that if that were the kind of activity, it would likely be in FY22 or FY23. But we're watching this very closely, and we would be talking with the council about the options. And, you know, frankly, you know, you don't just not do a road project. That's not enough. You would have to do something more significant if the issue is ongoing funds. So part of this is looking at what gets cut and what can't be filled in. And so if it's a cut in ongoing revenue such as tax revenue, then that really requires a cut in ongoing services. And so that's the decision then the council has to make about what services it wants to forego. And when you, in Tacoma Park, because we have so few staff for the services we provide, a cut in services does mean a cut in staff.
Right. Could you talk a bit more about the constraints on using the library bond money? There are a number of questions about this.
Sure.
Are there any other options for use of the funds, however difficult they may be to exercise, and what might be feasible?
There's really not. We've been in contact with the entity, with the representative for the Maryland Infrastructure Fund. Obviously, investors have purchased the bonds through the market based on the fact that these are capital projects that are intended to be of a certain size and last a certain amount of time and are backed by tax money. And that's the nature of going into bonds. Basically, we would have to be in a situation where we go bankrupt for us to find some other kind of an option out of these. It really works best for the library. If the decision were not to do the library, we would have to somehow come up with some other project to build. And so that's, it's not tax money that gets saved. We would have to build something.
Okay. Right. Can you talk a bit about the speed camera fund balance? There appears to consistently be a speed camera fund balance at the beginning of the fiscal year. Why is such a balance needed, and why can't more or all of the funds be used for other public safety purposes to decrease the general fund spent annually?
I will need to look into that a little bit more. We don't have a lot of excess in our speed camera budget. And so it may be more of a timing issue than something else, but I will look at that and then I'll have to report that back at a work session.
Okay. So another question is, I think this relates to the overall budget. What is the current available surplus today, and how has it changed for each of the past 3-year anniversaries from today? I know it's a little bit specific, but can you talk a bit about surplus?
Well, I'm going to have to research that, especially looking at it for looking at a 3-year period. Certainly there are major projects that get delayed, so there's some surplus funds when we hit July 1. But when you look at our expenses versus our revenues, our expenses are higher, and so it really is. It goes to Councilmember Kovar's question a little bit about how do we display that? How does that work? One of the things that's just very awkward about a July 1, June 30 fiscal year is that it's middle of summer, and so that's when the construction projects are going on. Mm-hmm. And timing it, we essentially work on the budget in February and March, and so knowing where we'll be by June 30 is a little bit of a guess, and so it's always a little tricky when we have those. When we look at how the numbers carry over. We also have to have enough money if the project gets built to pay for the project. And so larger entities like the counties and the states, they have so much money that they can actually have more, they can be more precise in a way than we can. We have to actually have the money available in a small budget. And so it kind of looks big at the end of June 30, but it's not really that much. But I do want to get back to, because I appreciate the question. And I'm particularly intrigued by looking at it in 3-year periods.
Right. So there are several questions related to the balanced budget question. And mm-hmm. I think Councilmember Kovar
That's right.
asked the same question. It's just, it looks like there's a deficit of 6.2 million between the
Right.
funds taken in and funds spent. Can you talk a little bit more about that right now, or
Well, we have, I mean,
how
we
that's
have,
consistent with the requirement for a balanced budget?
I think I'd like to get back with a good statement. I will tell you, my finance director has a very clear description of that. You know, we have these funds available in the bank, and so we recognize how that adds up. But it's always a trick because there's also the issue of stuff doesn't really get carried over. We start with a new budget every July 1, and so it's a tricky description. I'd like to come back and provide a public answer that's clear.
Right. So there's a question about hiring a construction manager to oversee any major capital projects. Is hiring a construction manager part of the library construction budget?
Absolutely, I wouldn't do it without that. When I've lived through several construction projects, and kind of before I had a fairly significant role within the city administration, we started the community center project without one, and there were problems. By the time we did phase 2 of the community center project, the auditorium, the public works project, we had a construction manager on board. Yes, we paid the construction manager, but that construction manager identified problems in the plans, reviewed change orders, made recommendations about different, more effective, cost-effective ways to do things. And it by far saves money in the long run. I like the extra set of eyes by somebody who's familiar with reading plans and communicating with contractors. So I would not do a project without a construction manager.
With respect to the use of cable fund money, could the funds be used, instead of being used for the library, if that project were cut down substantially, could those cable fund monies be used for the changes to the police dispatching area that you talked about?
Some of them, yes, absolutely.
And
actually, I may very well go there along with the facility maintenance reserve to pay for those for the dispatch work. I just felt that given that we are in a pandemic and there's a lot of uncertainty, starting a project that it's not quite ready to go yet, and we can live a little bit longer the way it is. I just didn't move on that, but it certainly is a funding source for that project.
right. And
I just have a follow-up question. Sorry,
sure.
to the city clerk. Because I think I know where the question's coming from. There, and you may not know the answer to this yet. Is there enough funding in the cable funds to do the library and the police dispatch?
There are enough funds, in my view, to do the library and police dispatch if we use the funds that were identified in the facility maintenance reserve as well for the police dispatch and atrium. I wouldn't be comfortable paying for the police dispatch atrium fill-in fully with cable funds, but certainly we have about, I think, 500,000 in the facility maintenance reserve, most of which is not being spent this coming year. And so you combine the two and it would be fine.
Thank you.
Okay. We're just about through with the questions that I've received. There is a last question. I'm not quite sure I understand it, but you may. Do you feel there are any ethical concerns with paying less for library construction if those savings are due to laborers being paid less?
That's a good question. You know, we do look at what the hourly rates are for these various projects for the pay of the laborers. You know, there's a lot of overhead in construction projects, so I would have to look at the full package on that. We would not have kind of take advantage of laborers.
I feel like I've covered everything that we've received that's not duplicative, and I don't see, I feel like the question in the, oh, maybe there's another question that I'm
There's
not
two
seeing.
questions I see under Q&A, but I haven't opened them.
Okay, so yeah, the first one is the balanced budget question again. So then that's was provided several times and from various sources. Does an ECI, here's a question, does an ECI of 2.9% equate to a raise of that amount? It sounds like you account for healthcare expenses in the HR budget.
Yes, so the when we look at how we have in the past paid and identified a wage structure for the pay scale, we do not use the ECI amount that includes the health amount. And so that that amount this year, I think, is a 2.8 or a little bit lower. I will double check. But we use the amount that is without, when we're talking for our wage negotiations, we back out the health item.
Okay. At this point, I don't see any other questions. And I haven't received any others by email. And I have to say, I know people sent lengthy questions, and I hope that they can come to the public hearing and say all the things that they'd like to say to the council and to you. I really focused on just pinpointing the questions without all the other information that was provided. So I hope I didn't do a disservice to residents who took the time to write.
Thank you, and I look forward to reading through I saw a few of the questions that were submitted earlier, or the emails that were submitted. I'm looking forward to looking through that completely, so that as I'm preparing information for the work sessions, I can deal with that. I'm also, I love to hear from people. So if somebody wants to reach out to me directly, that's fine as well. And I would normally be a little bit more prepared for some of the answers tonight on a different year. The pandemic really is a different concept for a budget process. And I want to go back and just say that my staff in the different departments in the finance division just did a phenomenal job. And not only did they do a good job putting the information together in the first place, really looking at council goals and what was an efficient way of moving forward on council goals. But as soon as the pandemic hit, they started looking at what are the impacts and what might happen and how can they not only serve the public, but how do they reflect those changes or start gathering the numbers that will be useful for the council as we go through the budget reconciliation process. I frankly was blown away with the quality of the work that I got from each and every department, given the fact that they are working really long hours also during this pandemic. And this, I have to say, I'm just really touched that I have such a wonderful group to work with.
Great. And I'm sure the city clerk can circulate the written comments as well, the written and comments to the whole city council, so we can see those. This kicks us off for our first meeting regarding our budget this year. I want to thank the city manager for her presentation. Welcome again our new deputy city manager. And also just extend my thanks to our city clerk, since this is not normally her role in reading out the questions and going through them. So, and I want to thank my colleagues on the city council this evening, as well as members of the public who have watched, sent in their questions, and joined us today. So thank you, everyone. We are not meeting, just as a reminder, this Wednesday because it is Passover. So we don't have a Wednesday night meeting. Our next meeting will be next Monday. It is again a work session. We will have, so there are no public comments during our Monday budget work sessions. And we will be digging into more information. And then we will meet on April 15th. We have 2 voting items. One is on the library, and one is on purchasing a replacement van, moving to a hybrid van. So,
And also, Mayor, Mayor, I'm sorry. The other thing is a budget public hearing on the 15th.
Yes, in the budget public hearing, yeah. So we'll have all information about signing up and doing all that on the city website. Thank you all for being with us this evening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.